Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another round of the Libertarian Angle.
It's great to be here once again to talk about an important issue with you and, of course, our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, feeling is mutual. I thought we would discuss the concept of the income tax, given that last week was April 15th, the traditional deadline by which Americans are required by law to file their income tax returns and pay any taxes that they owe to the U.S. government, compliments, of course, of the Internal Revenue Service. The income tax, Richard, in my opinion, is one of the greatest mistakes that America ever made. It is a major infringement on the principles of individual liberty. Keep in mind that the American people lived without income taxation and an IRS for, some 125 years, for more than a century. And that's because our American ancestors, the framers, the founding fathers, they despised the idea of a tax on income. They saw it as a major infringement on the principles of freedom. So it's not a coincidence that there was no income tax in America for most of that period of time, for the first more than a century of American history. And the idea is that in a free society, people have the fundamental God-given right to keep everything they earn. I mean, these are one of the fundamental rights that Thomas Jefferson referred to in the Declaration of Independence, the document that Americans today still celebrate on the 4th of July, that people have a right to keep everything they earn and to decide for themselves what to do with it, share it with others, donate it, invest it, save it, hoard it, whatever. That's one of the fundamental bedrocks of a free society, and our ancestors understood that. By the same token, they also rejected the things that the income tax funds today, like the welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, education grants, foreign aid to dictators, and all of the other coercive transfer programs. Effectively, our country was founded on the concept of a separation of charity and the state, where charity was entirely voluntary, and it came out of the money that people were free to keep for themselves. And, of course, there was no warfare state, or what President Eisenhower called a military-industrial complex. What we know today is the national security establishment. So you didn't have this huge military intelligence establishment to fund the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, all the so-called defense contractors, and all the foreign interventions in foreign wars. So without those things, you really didn't need an income tax. And so it's also not surprising that you had a period of time from 1790 or so all the way up to around 1916 when the 16th Amendment was enacted and the income tax came into existence as a permanent state, that this great period of economic prosperity. I mean, massive accumulations of capital, making people more productive, which gave rising standards of living, rising wage rates. So you have essentially two separate systems in American history. A system where people were free to keep everything they earned, where there was no welfare warfare state, and then a totally opposite type of system known as the welfare warfare state, funded by this huge monstrosity called the income tax. What do you think?
Well, first of all, the current election cycle has influenced me, and I've been feeling the burn, Jacob. And I now realize that you need to be taxed 100% for the good of the society, that clearly you're part of the exploiting 1% that harms humanity. So socialism now, socialism, no. Okay, don't get nervous, viewers.
Beep, beep, beep.
To reiterate some of the important points that you've just mentioned, before 1913, we obviously did not have an income tax. All levels of government, federal, state, and local, absorbed less than 8% of what today we call the gross national product. That is the value of the economic pie. And indeed, in as late as 1913, a majority of the collected taxes went to the state and local levels, not the federal government. Of course, today that's absolutely reversed, and the federal government and the state and local governments absorb well over 40%, nearly 50%, depending upon how you want to calculate and measure it, and what you count as an inclusive tax of the national income of the society. Before 1913, how then did the federal government finance itself? Surely that's an issue that people say, well, if not the income tax, how would the government, even for legitimate functions, which obviously in 1913 they were doing more of or limited to doing more of than today. And they basically, with the broadly defined three sources of federal income tax. There were import duties. Now, America has had a roller coaster history with import taxes. Sometimes they were merely meant to be like a low import sales tax to generate revenue for the federal government. Other times they were used for protectionist purposes, that is to limit foreign competition. But in general, the revenues from the import duties were meant as a revenue source. The other two sources were land sales, that is, land in the territories of the federal government, owned by the federal government out west, mostly at that time, of course, west of the Mississippi. And then the third source were some what today we would call sales taxes in the form of goes under the name of sin taxes, primarily excise taxes on alcohol and tobacco. And when a government is limited in both its size and its scope, it is amazing how little revenue that government needs to do the minimal but constitutionally required functions laid out by the Founding Fathers. So, in fact, one can have a government, especially one that is limited in its size and its scope, with a much narrower base and a non-income seizing form of taxation. And it's interesting to note that in the debates leading up to the income tax amendment, many were concerned about that this was a form of fiscal socialism. Back then, there was a weekly news magazine called the Literary Digest, sort of like the Time magazine of its time. And they did a piece about the debates over the passing of the 16th Amendment as it was approaching a passage. And they were quoting several people there who were critical of the income tax amendment. And they argued that if this amendment ever passed and was then instituted, why, we would be threatened with confiscatory taxation. They would be threatening the financial foundations of the society. And why? Because the income tax could go as high as 5%. Now, the result is that having been based on a system of more or less indirect taxes, as they're called, not directly from income, the government switched. Now, as maybe some of our viewers and listeners may know from a bit of history, an income tax had been passed during the Civil War by the Lincoln administration. In fact, there were two attempts to implement an income tax. Eventually, when those cases went to the Supreme Court that were challenging it, both times in the late 19th century, the Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional. That's why they had to pass an amendment to the Constitution to implement an income tax. But this has ended up totally transforming the way the government finances a good amount of its revenues. First of all, it has enabled the government to have access to people's income at its direct source. Now, it is true that before the Second World War, taxes were paid mostly in a lump sum by a rather narrow base of people on tax day. But during the Second World War, the federal government instituted withholding tax. And while it may be a shock to some of our listeners who hold him in high esteem as a free market economist, a good reason for this implementation was due to Milton Friedman, who was working for the U.S. Treasury during the Second World War. And because the government said that it needed a continuous inflow of revenues to cover its war expenditures, the proposal was made and implemented for withholding of income by the employer before the employee received what would then be his net pay. I should say that Rose Friedman, Milton Friedman's wife, declared that that was the one thing her husband did for which she could never forgive him, pushing the withholding tax. But the danger of this is a number of them. One, I believe it desensitizes the population to what the burden of taxes are on them. We all have a shock, in a sense, when we have our first job, our first, quote, real job, and we've been hired at a certain wage, and then we get our first paycheck, and we see that it's much smaller than the gross pay that we had negotiated or accepted because income tax has been withdrawn. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, et cetera, all of them. That shocks us. But the point is we've become desensitized to it. And so as the calendar year goes by, we get used to thinking that our income is that net amount after the government has taken a large portion of it. And we have forgotten that really what we had agreed to be paid by our employer was that gross amount, that's what the market determined to be our wealth and our value before the state seized and siphoned off a huge chunk of it for one purpose or another. The other thing is it affects our psychology significantly, because then what happens is that we see individuals take the attitude when income tax day comes that they fill out their forms and submit their income tax form, and then they're joyful. They're getting a refund. My gosh, the government is giving me money. What is forgotten is that, in fact, this is a sum of your money that the government appropriated in excess of what you legitimately, under the income tax regulations, were required to pay. This is not a gift. This is basically getting a part of your income back, which the government has had the use of for a portion of the calendar year without paying you interest for it. They've had an interest-free loan from you and then have paid back the principal, if you will. And that creates a false psychology in people's minds as well, Jacob, I would argue. Then, in addition, the income tax has become an engine of redistributive ideology. Now, the income taxes have sometimes been more progressive and less progressive. The tax brackets have been modified and changed under these administrations or those administrations and so on. But the entire premise of the income tax as it is practiced in the United States is the idea that those who earn more should be penalized for having been more productive and wealth generating in the society. That is, the wealthier you are, all other things held given, the higher the proportion or percentage of your income that you should pay to the government. Now, this has all been used as a way to siphon off wealth from one sector of the economy, and through either direct redistribution or various in-kind and related government programs to siphon it off and redistribute to another sector of the economy, basically as part of an implicit ideology of wealth equalization. Now, of course, the special interests play on the system. They get loopholes, they get deductions and all the other things. But ideologically, the system has been made in the United States as a means of implementing one of the ideals and principle of an equalizing of wealth. And the other aspect of this, if I can just continue a bit more, Jacob, and you mentioned this when you mentioned the IRS, is that this has given an immense intrusive power to the federal government at the expense of every citizen in the country, under the premise and under the belief that every American might be hiding a dollar, some fraction of which rightfully belongs to Uncle Sam. The IRS declares its right and legal responsibility and, in fact, duty to intrude into every aspect and corner of our financial and personal affairs. We have to keep records. We have to report. Other sources report to the federal government what we have earned and what should be the portion taken out as our payment, our tribute to the federal government, so that, in fact, it becomes a huge fiscal police state in which we are surveillanced, watched, and expected to report and potentially investigated under the premise that income belongs to the state, and they will determine how much we must pay and what they will allow us to retain on this redistributive principle. All of these are the bases for thinking, in my humble opinion, as to why the income tax was, as a fundamental idea, and certainly as it has been implemented in practice, a grievous challenge and threat and denial of a huge amount of personal liberty and freedom, and equally privacy. Can it be abused, besides them looking to our lives for their fiscal surveillance purposes? But it also can be a political weapon, as was shown a few years ago when the IRS was accused and basically demonstrated to have misused its power, even under the law, to target certain groups that, for ideological reasons, the existing administration wished not to have access as much as they could have to influencing the political process.
Yeah, you made several good points there. First of all, on the founding of the income tax, at that time they promised, you mentioned the 5% figure, but that was one of the promises that people were making when they were advocating the income tax, predominantly the progressives, is that it would only be a small tax, that it would never be a large tax, and that it would only be on the rich. And so here was one of the first times when they were really starting to appeal to the sense of envy and covetousness among people, that, don't worry, the money is never going to be taken from you. It's only going to be taken from the very, very rich. And even then, it's only going to be a small percentage. Well, of course, that wasn't built into the 16th Amendment, that limitation, and so the floodgates were open until the point where we have it today, where really it's the middle class and the poor who are suffering the biggest detriment of the income tax. They're the ones that pay the lion's share of this thing, and hardly anyone saves any money anymore because they've got to send so much of it to the IRS. And the other point you made about how the government attained this enormous amount of power is very interesting too. I think the income tax really upended the relationship of master and servant between the citizen and the federal government. That when people were free to keep everything they earned, they were in charge of their lives. They could keep everything they earned. They could become tremendously wealthy, which really can be a counterbalance to a strong, powerful government when there's a strong financial base in the private sector. But there was a sense of sovereignty, of power, in the terms of that you could make as much money as you want, and there wasn't a darn thing the government could do about it. Even if they hated the fact that you had money, they couldn't take it from you, at least not directly. And yet, when the income tax was adopted, that turned upside down, where now the government was in charge. The government becomes the master because the government is setting the percentage. And sometimes they're nice and they set the percentage low. Sometimes they're not so nice and they set the percentage high. But at this point, the entity that's in charge, that's in control, is the government. The citizenry become the serfs. So the way I see it now with the income tax, it really is a matter of like an allowance that a parent gives a child, that the government essentially has nationalized income. It owns everybody's income, and it permits people to keep a certain percentage as an allowance. I mean, the more honest system would be where everybody sends 100% of their income to the government, and then the government doles it out in terms of how much they think each person should be able to keep. But that, in reality, is the system we have today, by the government being able to keep the percentage. So it totally upended the idea of master and servant in American society.
I would argue that another thing is that much of the tax evasion and tax avoidance that are raised as bugaboo issues by those in the political arena, people not paying their fair share, people avoiding taxes that they should pay, even if they somehow are using even a loophole in the tax code. This all has to do with the fact is that once they could control the direct source of income, as you correctly pointed out, changing the relationship between master and servant, this became a huge engine for the growth of government. They didn't have to say, how much more do we need to raise an import tax or somehow raise excise taxes on tobacco and alcohol to be able to justify a growth in federal government program X, Y, Z, and so on. Now, they could just modify the tax code and have this fiscal horn of plenty out of which to fund a vast amount of what served the interests of the politicians, the bureaucrats, and the special interest groups by siphoning off a greater amount of wealth more easily and directly from the population. And when that happens, when people sense that the government is taking more and more of their income that they have earned, that creates an incentive, a motivation for people to devise ways both legally and illegally to avoid and evade the government taking as much of the income that they feel justly belongs to them, having earned it, one presumes, honestly in the marketplace. So the very corruption and manipulations and intrigues that arouse the ire of the U.S. government, of the European Union, international organizations. We have to close the loopholes. We have to shut down the tax havens in various parts of the world. They have created this monster. If I can use an example of how taxing less creates less of an environment for such evasion and corruption. After the fall of the Soviet Union, in then Russia, non-communist Russia, they obviously had an income tax, and it was a rather highly progressive income tax. The result being is that there was corruption, evasion, attempts to hide wealth in various ways. Then when Vladimir Putin first became president, and I feel uncomfortable saying anything good about him, as I hope the listeners and viewers would appreciate, he is an authoritarian thug who power lusts in various and sundry ways. But he had a number of economic advisors, one of which was Andrei Illarionov, who had a break with him and now is sort of a scholar with the Cato Institute. But what Andrei Illarionov and a number of other enlightened and intelligent, market-oriented Russian economists got Putin to do was to introduce a relatively low, that is compared to what the income taxes had been, a relatively low flat income tax of around 16%. What was discovered is that once this flat income tax was introduced, that is, you got rid of the progressivity and the steep progressivity, the result is that the corruption and the evasion due to that tax influence diminished significantly, and the government's revenues went up. So in fact, they generate many of the corruptions and evasions and avoidance that they wring their hands about through their own lust after grabbing and grasping more and more of the wealth of the people.
Yeah, and your point about the welfare warfare state programs that they fund is really good too. I mean, you can't divorce the out-of-control spending from the income tax. And as you point out, once they got the income tax, I mean, the floodgates were open for the spending because all they had to do was just increase spending. They didn't have to justify their programs and then raise the taxes to fund those programs. And it has been out of control ever since. And that's why when these candidates, presidential candidates and other candidates are calling for like tax reform with a flat tax or a income tax return that'll fit on a stamp and all that nonsense, it really doesn't make any difference because they never talk about slashing spending. So if you don't slash spending, somehow or another you're going to have to raise the money that's going to fund that, to fund the spending. So, okay, let's say you have a flat tax or whatever. If people are still paying the same amount in taxes, where's the benefit from it? Now, it's true that you may not no longer have the tyrannical agency like an IRS, but regardless, whatever agency is in existence and is charged with funding this $3 trillion monstrosity or whatever, it's going to be tyrannical by its own terms. And the founding fathers, they really did have insights into this concept of indirect and direct taxes. That they favored the idea of indirect taxes, although it's not a perfect concept. But they saw that in terms of tyranny, an institution like the IRS that could come, as you point out, and search into your records and require that you report and require that you incriminate yourself and delve into all your private affairs, that is the essence of tyranny. That at least with an indirect tax, like a sales tax or a tariff or something like that, an excise tax, that the individual citizen is not assaulted directly by a tyrannical agency. Now, I'm not defending those taxes. I mean, my own personal opinion is that the ideal government is one that is voluntarily funded. But in an imperfect world, Richard, I would take an indirect tax over a direct tax any day of the week.
Right. The point that you just raised about which was what I was saying also a few minutes ago about the IRS's asserting the authority to intrude into every aspect of our lives under the presumption we're hiding a dollar, they have a right to tax. There is one of the amendments in the Bill of Rights that says that the individual is to be secure in his person and his property from unwarranted search and seizure. Now, the fact is that the presumption is of guilt, and the IRS claims the authority from the employer, from the individual, to basically know everything about your personal financial affairs under, as I said, the presumption that you're guilty under the presumption that you might be hiding a dollar that the government has a right to tax. And therefore, what happens to the spirit of part of the Bill of Rights when they assert that right to continuously, year in and year out, to demand to know everything in your private affairs, even when there is no accusation or charge that you've committed a crime?
That's right, and even worse, there's no due process protections against them seizing money. I mean, there's been basic due process from Magna Carta as it developed and evolved, that before the government can take anything that belongs to you, it has to give you notice, has to give you a hearing. You have this concept of procedural due process where they have to go to court and justify why they're seizing your home or your land or something like that. The IRS is exempt from all that. They can seize your bank accounts without any kind of notice. If the bank doesn't comply, they'll just take the money from the bank. They can impose liens on your home and your property. They visit you in your homes. They'll even go to your children's school and harass your children there. I mean, they will stop at nothing to collect what they believe is their rightful amount of tax due, and there are no constitutional protections at all. And look at the kind of citizenry we have. I mean, who doesn't live in fear of the IRS or getting an IRS audit or even worse, a criminal prosecution? Everybody lives in fear of that because everybody knows that if they really want to search hard enough, they'll find something wrong with your tax return. That's the whole benefit of having this thick, multi-inch book of regulations, is that they know that everybody screws up at one point. And my opinion, Richard, is that's one of the major reasons why you never see American CEOs of big companies taking on the government in terms of criticizing its foreign policy or criticizing what it's doing at a fundamental basis, because they know that the IRS could always come after them. And you mentioned earlier about the IRS going after groups. We know how presidents have used the IRS in terms of going after their political enemies. And so it keeps a citizenry cowed over what can potentially be done to them by this tyrannical type of an agency.
Absolutely. And that is a fundamental reason why, at the end of the day, the advocate of freedom, the classical liberal, the libertarian, the constitutional conservative, rightly understood, all of them should share a strong and consistent and complementary interest in the repeal of the income tax, both as a way of eliminating this legalized intrusion into everyone's personal affairs, but also as a way to at least institutionally help rein in the ease of government growing in terms of what it spends and does with the wealth of the nation. What the spending side requires an ideological shift, which fortunately does not seem present right now in our country. There has to be a rethink about what are the legitimate functions of a government in a free society. What should government have the authority to do if one accepts and believes in a limited government? And what should that government not have the authority and the right to do in terms of regulation? To the fiscal reform. That is a radical ideological change in people's understanding, appreciation, and demand that government do X and Y and not everything else in the alphabet, which goes beyond the spirit and the belief of the ideology of liberty that guided the founding fathers of this country.
Yeah, and that's what this show's all about, is raising people's vision to a higher level. I mean, there are those that say, oh, that's just pie in the sky, it can't happen. That's nonsense. I mean, Americans proved that you can have a society that lasted for more than a century without an income tax and without a welfare state. So the idea that it's not possible is nonsense. And the fact that the income tax came into existence is proof that you can change a society. Society can shift. And even though it shifted in a bad direction, it certainly can do the other. It can shift into a good direction, which means a repeal, as you point out, of the 16th Amendment. And a restoration of the concept.
Yeah, if I can just add, if many viewers and listeners think that, oh, how could that have come about? Recall that it's been done before. There was an amendment prohibiting the production, sale, of alcohol in the United States, the Prohibition Amendment. It was on the books for 13 years, 1920 to 1933. How did that alcohol prohibition disappear? Through repeal from one amendment, repealing the earlier amendment. That is a precedent. But yes, there is a 16th Amendment to the Constitution allowing the government to tax our income directly. But there is no reason, with enough spirit and determination and belief, that another amendment could not overturn that amendment.
Yeah, that's a great example in the Prohibition Amendment. And yeah, that's where the power of ideas on liberty come about, that all of a sudden a shift in thinking can take place suddenly, unexpectedly, and all of a sudden we're looking back toward building on the principles on which this country was based. And one of those basic principles was you have a right to keep everything you earn. You decide what to do with it. Richard, on that note, we're out of time. As always, greatly enjoyed the show.
I enjoyed it too, once more. And I just want to thank again and again the viewers and listeners who take the time to spend a little bit of this time listening to and maybe learning something from the ideas that we exchange.
Yep, and I'll echo those thanks. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.